Just want to make a brief video on why I believe the Bible, in particular the Gospels, are not historical accounts about Jesus. Many people believe that the four Gospels paint a picture about Jesus, miracle-working Son of God, who preached throughout Jerusalem. We can see in this illustration here Jesus performing his first miracle, as recorded in the Gospel of John. And what's interesting is that Jesus' mother is right beside him. But we'll look into the scripture verses around that because this is interesting because it's portrayed differently in different Gospels, as I'll bring out. So first of all, we'll go to Mark chapter 3. This is early on in Jesus' ministry. And see here, this is about Jesus' mother and his brothers. So I'll start at verse 31 and read to verse 35. And we'll see the picture of Jesus and his family that we get here and see how it's different to the Gospel of John. It says, "And his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. And a crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, 'Your mother and your brothers are outside seeking you.' And he answered them, 'Who are my mother and my brothers?' And looking about at those who sat around him, he said, 'Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of God, he is my mother and sister and brother.'" So here we get the idea that Jesus' mother and brothers are on the outside. They're not doing the will of God, not believing in Jesus. We can see that confirmed in verse 20 and 21. It says, "Then he went home, and the crowd gathered again, so that they could not even eat. And when his family heard it, they went out to seize him, for they were saying, 'He is out of his mind.'" So here we get a picture of Jesus who doesn't have the support of his family members, and Jesus showing that because they're not doing the will of God, they're on the outer. We get this sense in Luke as well, in the parallel accounts, Luke chapter 8, verse 19 to 21, and Matthew 12, 46 to 50. But in John, as pictured in that illustration I showed at the start, we get a very different picture. So let's have a look. We'll look at John chapter 2, verses 3 to 5 and 12. This is very early on in Jesus' ministry, not long after he started, and his very first miracle, which occurred at the wedding feast in Cana. So it says here, Jesus was invited to a wedding with his disciples, and in verse 3, "When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, 'They have no wine.' And Jesus said to her, 'Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come.' His mother said to the servants, 'Do whatever he tells you.'" Now this is interesting because here at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, we see his mother who is standing with him, as illustrated here at the start of the video. And she's saying, "Do whatever he tells you to do." And then Jesus gives instructions on filling water jars with water, and it became wine. In verse 12 of John chapter 3, it says, "After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and sisters," in the footnote, "and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days." So we get a very different feel in this story of Jesus in John as compared to Mark. Here, his mother and his brothers and sisters and his disciples were all travelling with him. So they're not on the outer, they're part of his group. Now, if you read this plainly, it's a contradiction. So what's going on? Well, Christian apologists who look into these things and attempt to explain these things come up with varying viewpoints and reasons to harmonise these accounts together. And all the Christian churches do the same thing. In fact, even among Jehovah's Witnesses, we're taught to view these accounts as one account where details in one supplement the lack of detail in the other. So we're taught to look at them all together in one lump. But that creates problems, because if we do that and come up with an explanation as to why there's this apparent contradiction, it creates additional problems. For example, one possible explanation to this could be that perhaps this being at the very start of the ministry, Jesus had his family's support. But then a little bit later on, as Mark shows, he lost their support. And that would show why they were on the outer. But then if we look at Jesus' death in John, again we see his mother is right there. In John 19, 26 and 27, it says, and Jesus at this stage is on the cross and dying, but he says, when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour the disciple took her to his own home. So here again we see Jesus' mother come into the picture again at his death, obviously in support of her son. In the other Gospels, we don't really get this picture. So could it be that if we put it all together, that Mary supported her son at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, as we read in John, and then in Mark chapter 3, which is looking at a little bit later in Jesus' ministry, that his family no longer supported him, so they weren't doing the will of God that Jesus, as Jesus said in Mark 3:31 to 35. And then towards the end of his ministry, before his death, he had the support of his mother again. Could that be the case? Well, this creates problems, doesn't it, if we view it that way? So how else, or what other way could we view this? Well, could it be possible that the Gospels, which were written by different unknown authors at different time periods, were just portraying Jesus the way they saw fit, and that it has nothing to do with history at all, but they're just telling the story of a miracle-working Son of God who came to the earth to die for humanity, and they're each portraying him in different ways. And this is what we get when we read the accounts, because this is only one of many contradictions in the scriptures regarding Jesus' ministry, even the way he died, post-resurrection appearances. If you read and compare each of the Gospels, they are all different. So they're just individual accounts portraying Jesus in the way they saw fit to do so, and they have nothing to do with trying to present a accurate historical picture of Jesus at all. They are painting very different pictures of Jesus. Mark, one where he didn't have his family's support, and you see that consistently throughout the gospel. And in John, consistently from the beginning and the end, Jesus did have the support of his family. Now, the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all paint the same picture with regard to the support of Jesus by his family, or lack of, I should say. And this makes sense because Matthew and Luke have copied much of the material word for word from the Gospel of Mark, whereas the Gospel of John has a lot of unique information, which I think it's about 90% unique compared to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So that's just something I wanted to share. This shows that these apparent contradictions really are not such a big deal if we don't consider the Gospels as historical documents. It's only when we try to consider them as accurate historical pictures of Jesus that the contradictions become a problem. And so that's just something to consider with how we approach the Bible. And there are many more examples of this, but I just wanted to go into this one about Jesus and how his family did or didn't support him according to which Gospels you read. So I hope you enjoy this video. Feel free to comment, and we'll see you next time.